Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me here today. It seems fitting that you would ask me to address the communication gap because the firm I'm with, FleishmanHillard, we spend a lot of time studying and working to close the authenticity gap. And I think as I work through the information I have to share with you today, you'll see some strong parallels to the challenge we've been talking about at this meeting, and hopefully some solutions for helping us move forward. We've talked a lot about the New World Order, where we're dealing with highly connected, empowered, individual stakeholders. And in this day and age, we know that our brand, what we tell consumers to expect of us, is not the only or most important thing. It's also about what others say about us, our reputation. Our brand tells people, gives people a promise, tells them what they can expect from interactions with us. And a brand can be your personal brand, an industry brand, or a company brand. And then your reputation is the collection of all the experiences the public has with your brand. And the gap, the authenticity gap, if you will, is the difference between what you tell them they can expect, what they believe they can expect, and what they experience from you. Let's talk about another gap, though, the difference between what we think is agriculture industry and what the public says. Or, said another way, what we think consumers think versus what they actually say. Many of you participated in a pre-conference survey, about 80 of you. I really appreciate you playing along. Thank you very much. And I ask you to speculate about how consumers might respond to some questions. No surprise, there's a gap. I'm going to again ask you to play along and not question the gap, not overthink the gap. You know who you are. You're going to be looking at the methodology behind the gap. But hear what the gap has to tell us, because when we are aware of it and we start to understand it, that's the only time where we're actually going to be able to address it and move forward. So let's dive in. I started by asking you, or one of the questions I asked you was, true or false? Consumers value information from relevant companies and organizations more than information from blogs, forums, and online communities. This is a no-brainer, right? Most of us said false. Consumers cannot possibly value information from our organizations and companies, right? Because we see the social swirl, we see the sound bites getting more play than the messages from our companies. And it feels like, no, they can't possibly value that. But the truth is, they say they value the information from relevant companies and organizations about third, not too far behind traditional media and knowledgeable friends and family. Blogs and online sources are further down the list. They play into the mix, but our voice is important. What's important to hear here is your voice is important. I've seen too many organizations, companies especially, who are selling a product, use this as an excuse not to engage. Well, we're not credible. We should work with other people to tell this story for us. How many of us have been in a meeting where we were brainstorming the best messenger for something? A new idea, somebody to sell a new idea. Or worse yet, to deliver bad news. It's never us. We're never the best person. It's never our company. It's never our industry. But what if it is? What if it's all of us? What if we all are credible in our own way because we all contribute a different type of information that consumers say they want? And therefore, it's all of our responsibilities to help close the communication gap. I also ask you to tell me what words or phrases you've heard consumers use related to antibiotics and animal agriculture that concern you the most. Here's what I want you to notice about this blob up on the screen. There are a lot of words. There were definitely some similarities. But a lot of stuff, a lot of things concern us about this topic. We've heard a lot of things that trouble us. And then I want you to notice that some of the words are pretty technical. Not technical to people in this room, but definitely technical to people outside this room. Words like indiscriminate, efficiency. Consumers don't think about efficiency in food. Unsanitary, bacterial residue, technical terms. And here are the words they say. This is what comes up when consumers are talking about antibiotics in animal agriculture online and when it's discussed in the media. So here's what to notice about this. Shorter, simpler words, fewer words. This boils down to growth, pumped, hormones, versus treat, dose, diagnose. And we can also see what we talked about earlier, that there isn't discrimination between antibiotics and growth promotants. All of this comes together in a perception of how we're raising animals for food. So I want you to think about a couple things. Some of the words that we're most concerned about as an industry that we try to avoid so that we don't reinforce misperceptions are the very words consumers are using to talk about this topic. And maybe we can't bridge the gap unless we're using their language. The other thing to think about is some of these words aren't negative to consumers. Free from, that's a positive thing for them. Traceable, that's very positive. Do they have to be bad things to us? What if we could say that we are helping animals live lives free from illness and disease? I ask you to say how you thought consumers might rate the industry's performance in some areas. Productivity, innovation, environment, doing the right thing, and credible communication. Here's what we said. We thought consumers would give us credit for performance and innovation. Maybe not so much on credible communication or on the environment. Here's what consumers say. This is the authenticity gap for the agriculture industry. The black line represents the expectations of the industry from consumers. This is what they expect us to perform on. The orange represents their experience with the industry. So you can see that, indeed, they give us a tremendous amount of credit for performance. And in fact, we over-index on performance. It's almost like they're saying, we get it. You produce a lot, and you're good at it. They don't give us credit for innovation or environmental stewardship, which is ironic as we sit in a meeting talking about how we move animal health forward and how it's so critical to the future sustainability of the industry and how we meet broad public expectations for responsible production. And then credible communication is our weakest area. My hypothesis is this, if you'll indulge me, is that we tend to respond to questions and concerns by defending what we do, which is we're productive. But consumers already give us credit for that. So that doesn't answer their question. What they really want to know is how and why, especially in the areas of doing the right thing for the environment, and they want to hear those things in a credible way. Not surprisingly, we think closing the gap on this topic is really important, even though there are a variety of issues and challenges facing our industry. We still say that given all that, the majority of us believe it's critical that we address this gap. Well, that's good. We're getting somewhere because consumers agree, and especially Gen Z. We've been talking a lot about millennials. We've mentioned it a couple times. As the member of a forgotten generation, Gen X, nobody cared about Gen X. It went straight to millennials. And we're forgetting to look down the line and realize that there's another generation equally, if not more powerful, coming online behind millennials. They're going to be 40% of the population in 2020. They carry a tremendous amount of buying power, and they're more socially conscious than millennials were. And we thought millennials were more socially engaged. But these folks almost 3/4 say they're willing to pay more for products from companies that are committed to doing the right thing for the environment and society. So let's talk a little bit about this generation, because I think they represent an opportunity for us to engage a segment of the population that wants to be part of the solution. Christine talked about how millennials kind of got a bad rap. Well, Gen Z is going to turn that around. As the first all-digital generation, they're very tech-savvy, and therefore more likely to be accepting of and understand how our industry uses technology. Think about the power in that. They're socially responsible and future-focused. They believe in and want to see a changed world, and they believe that they can be part of it. But at the same time, they're realistic. They've grown up in a time that's caused them to be a little pragmatic and resilient. And so they want to identify challenges head on and be part of the solution. So I might even suggest that we either, as an industry, engage them in helping us solve our challenges, or they'll fix them for us. So how do we engage with this generation? How do we communicate with them? Well, first we have to understand how they communicate. We'll have to get nimble, quick, and digital in order to be successful with this generation. Folks who replace texting with images. They don't even text words anymore. Christine mentioned Snapchat. It's photo filters, Bitmojis, and Giphies. And they're quick. They love video, YouTube, but also think 6-second videos on Vine. So what if that video we saw earlier is 30 times too long for the attention span of Gen Z? Think about how we tell stories even more impactfully and quicker. So we need to communicate through stories. It sounds simple. We talked about it a little bit earlier, but it's so critical. And we know that in our core, but let me just remind us why storytelling is so important. Stories are persuasive. Data doesn't sell an argument. Emotions do. Sometimes emotional data can, but the emotions are critical, especially on a topic like food that's so personal. Stories are memorable. How many times when we've gone to recite a piece of data have we said, now don't quote me on this, because we can't quite remember the exact number, the exact statistic. But stories we don't forget. In fact, they get better with time as we tell them more and more. Stories captivate and motivate. Don't tell my dad I said that. Stories captivate and motivate because people like to hear stories about other people. They're interested in people like themselves or people they know or things they don't know at all. Stories are shareable. They have a built-in ROI because people keep telling them, especially when they're really good and meaningful. And stories are immersive. If we want people to understand the challenge and the complexity, we have to help them spend a moment in our shoes and see the decisions that a farmer has to make or a veterinarian has to make, and help them see themselves in those shoes making that tough decision. That's the power of what a story can do. But how do we talk to consumers? We talk in messages. We love message tracks. I do too. I've written plenty of them. But here's the problem with messages, is that although they may sound amazing on paper and highlight the superior writing skills of the person who put them together, they're often lost on the people they're supposed to influence. Because in part, they're written for a group of people. But our audiences don't fit in these nice, tidy buckets of people. Unfortunately, despite all the efficiencies we want to find in production and communication, our audience is an individual. They exist in units of one. The other problem with our messages is they're written. And I just told you how Gen Z communicates. They're also written at an audience with the predetermined outcome that you're going to hear them and not react to them. They don't allow responsiveness, skepticism, or engagement. So why do we communicate with messages and not with stories? Well, in large part because people are natural storytellers, organizations aren't. And our organizations, our companies, our brands, has to get better at storytelling. All have to get better at storytelling. The ag industry has come a long way in building advocacy. So many farmers and ranchers on social media telling their story and giving consumers a view into what life on the ranch is like. But our companies, our brands, the thought leaders in agriculture have been slow to step up and have a voice, maybe because they believed they weren't credible, and to empower their people to help share a story on their behalf. When we allow people to tell that story, it can be so powerful. I actually presented to a company where about advocacy, and one of the employees came up to me afterwards and said, you know, this is all great, and I would love to talk to people about what I do and this topic, but we're not really allowed to talk about this outside of work. And I said, what, really? You have a policy that says you can't talk about this? Gosh, I think so. Well, turns out, no, they don't. But they do have a policy that says you can't talk to media, or if you do talk to media, you don't represent the views of the companies. We heard some of those disclaimers earlier. And those are important. I understand the legal significance of that. But it creates a culture where people feel like they're supposed to be quiet. And it's holding back one of our most powerful armies of storytellers. Think about the power if we let those people loose to talk about why they got into ag, to talk about why they enjoy working where they do, and the difference they get to make. So last survey question, and perhaps the least scientific of them all, my answered categories weren't at all valid, I'm sure. I know that we desperately want to know the time horizon at what point we're all going to be in harmony and see things the same way. But the reality is consumers are changing. I talked to you about Gen Z, and we nearly unanimously agree the ag industry is going to change more in the next 5 years than it has in the last 5. Perhaps more in the next 10 than the last 10. So with all that change, and the fact that this gap didn't develop overnight, it has practically existed since we stopped directly living off the land, some of our population. And so we can't expect to one day wake up and have the gap been bridged overnight in our sleep. The reality is it's a journey, and we can't say how long it's going to take, and sadly, it may never end. So we may have to find our fulfillment and satisfaction in the journey itself and get better at walking back and forth across the bridge.